DotVVM is an open source framework that lets you build web applications using the model view model pattern. DotVVM can also be used to modernize web forms applications or any other applications running on old ASP.NET, because DotVVM supports the new .NET Core and .NET 5 and also old .NET Framework projects. This image shows the process if you are using just the ASP.NET Web Forms application. So your project is running on .NET Framework, and if you get an HTTP request for your application, it gets processed by the classic ASP.NET Web Forms pipeline. There is probably some authentication, most commonly the forms authentication, and based on the URL, the request is routed to a particular ASPX page, which is probably using some master page, and that's how the request gets routed to the correct page and gets processed. To use DotVVM inside of web forms projects, you need to install two NuGet packages, DotVVM.owin and Microsoft owin host system web. The second package will add an owin request pipeline in front of the web forms pipeline. So if the application gets an HTTP request, it goes to the owin pipeline first, and that's where DotVVM is hooked up in this pipeline. And if DotVVM can process the request, it will do it through some DotVVM page you will create in your project. But if there is no page that would be able to handle the request gets passed to the web forms pipeline. So the application still works, and even if you just install these packages and do not add any DotVVM page in the project, the application will work. So eventually you will get to the point where you have replaced all ASPX pages with DotVVM pages. So you only have DOT HTML files and DOT master page in the project, but you are still running on the old framework. So then it's quite simple, because you just need to change your CSproj file so it will reference .NET Core, and you will also need to swap NuGet packages. Before you were using .vvm.owin, but you can switch the package for .vvm.ASP.NET Core, and it will hook up to the new ASP.NET Core request pipeline as a middleware. And the last thing you will probably need to change will be the authentication, because the forms authentication is not supported on .NET Core, so you will have to replace it for the cookies authentication middleware that is part of ASP.NET Core, for example. Or you can find any other way of authentication. So that's how the process looks like. You can start in your legacy web forms application. You will just install a few NuGet packages. Then you can plan your modernization process. It can take a couple of weeks or maybe months, but still you can deliver new features, because you can still update and modify the ASPX files and deploy the project. And you can do the modernization basically on the fly. So you don't need to lock yourself up in the cellar and for 2 years and just let the users wait until you create a new version of application on .NET Core from scratch. You can just reuse a lot of things you already have in the project. And of course, it looks like a lot of rewriting work, but still there will be hundreds or maybe thousands of classes that contain your business logic or data access and things like that. And you don't need to touch them at all, because .vvm view models are running on the server the same way as the code behind for the pages. So basically you will be using the same methods to access the database, the same method to implement your business logic. You can call the same API, use the same business layer. So you don't need to have two separate apps, because that brings a lot of challenges. You will need to do the authentication so it works in both applications, so some single sign-on experience. Or if you were modernizing with other technology than .vvm, maybe for example Angular or React, you will need to find a way to get the data from the server to the client. So you would need to expose your existing business logic as an API and be able to get these data on the client. With .vvm, you don't need to do any of this, because .vvm solves this way using the MVVM approach. It will make your view model accessible from the client side without the need to build any kind of API. And the best thing for me is that you can deploy at any time, because the application will still work. You can still compile the project and deploy the same way as you did before, because you are still running on .NET Framework. And also, if you will be running on .NET Core, it means that you can also run on Linux or on Mac. And of course, .VVM supports .NET 5, so everything I said about .NET Core applies also to .NET 5, which is basically a successor of .NET Core. How you should start to modernize a web forms app? I have downloaded the blogengine.net, which is a popular open source blogging site project. And it's a web forms application, so you can see all these ASPX files here. And if you want to start modernizing web forms app with .VVM, the first thing you should do is to install .VVM Visual Studio extension. So if you go to extensions and manage, you can search for .VVM, and it should find the .VVM for Visual Studio 2019, and you can just install it from here. When you install the extension and open the web forms project, you can right click on the project, and there is a new option which is called add .VVM, and it allows you to install .VVM packages and configure everything so you can start your modernization. So there is plenty of things that will happen when you do this. So there is a list of what we will do to your project. So let's do it. It takes a couple of seconds. So let's just skip the waiting. Okay, so now if you look in the references, you will see references to .VVM framework libraries, because .VVM is just a NuGet package. And you will also see the startup CS, which is an OWIN pipeline configuration. So basically we are calling use.vvm, which hooks up .VVM middleware in the pipeline. And this pipeline goes first before the web forms. So if the request is handled by .VVM, it will just be, the response will be just sent to client. And if .VVM cannot handle the request, it will pass it down to the web forms pipeline. So if you create a .VVM page that will work on the same route, on the same URL as your web forms page, then .VVM will have priority. So that's how you can replace your pages. You can just create .VVM pages, map them to the same URL, and they will be used instead of ASPX pages. And if anything goes wrong, you can just rename or disable the .VVM page, and you can still keep using the old ASPX one. There is also .VVM startup where you can configure routing. There is a default strategy that will look in the views folder and use the page name to determine the URL, but you can map the pages to any other URLs which you will probably want to do. There is also the views and view models folders which are prepared for you, so you can just start creating new pages. So let's do it. I will add new item, and the .VVM extension will give you this new section with .VVM types of pages. So there is .VVM page, there is master page, user control, and a lot of other things. So let's create a page that's called test. I just want to make sure that the integration works. So this window asks me if I want to also create a view model. So yes. And so I have a .VVM page and appropriate view model for it. So now I can use all the features that .VVM allows me. So hello from .VVM. I can use components. So there is, for example, DOT text box. And I can, for example, bind the text box to some property in the view model. So for example, your name, and the property doesn't exist in the view model, so I can have it created, and so that's how it works. If you look in the view model, it generated a string property for me, so that's how you work with state. Basically everything which can change in the page, which is dynamic, you have to persist in your in the properties in your view model. So this is the simplest .VVM page ever. Let's add a button, for example, so we can use this function, change name, And if I have the method created, I can just set your name equals Joe. Okay, so that's how it works. Basically, you have properties to maintain the state of the page. You have commands which you can call from button controls and other things. And there are a lot advanced controls like grid view or file upload, repeater, and all those things you would expect in a framework based on ASP.NET. Now, this is the default page of the block engine. So that's the web forms page, and it looks like if you just download blockengine.net, that's what you would see. So that it works. So the web forms in the application is still working. And if I go to /test, then it takes a second or two until .vvm is initialized on the first request, but if you refresh it, it's immediate. And this is a .vvm page running inside my application. So this doesn't look really nice. Of course, you would need to use the same CSS, so both pages would look like they belong to the same app, but still you are running in the same application. So I can enter my name, Thomas, but if I click change name, it will change the name to Joe. So you can see .vvm works. It's able to accept the commands from buttons and things like that. Probably in most applications, you will need to deal with authentication. And it's very simple in .vvm because thanks to the Owen pipeline integration to the ASP.NET infrastructure, if you just do the sign in the web forms part, the .vvm will also have access to the signed user. So if and it's really natural because I can, for example, use the authenticated view control, and it can display different content to anonymous users and authenticated users. So for example, I can see here, hello anonymous. And if you are authenticated, I can say, for example, welcome back. So now if I go back to the browser and refresh the page, there is, I can see hello anonymous because I am not signed in. But if I go to admin, to /admin, which is a page in the blockengine.net, yeah, so this is also in web forms. So when I go to and use the default credentials, now I'm signed in. And if I go back to the test page, you can see there is welcome back. So the .vvm naturally sees whether the user is signed in or not. And of course, even if you sign in through .vvm, then web forms would have access to the user. Yeah? So the single sign-on experience works automatically. You don't need to do anything. So now we have running .vvm and web forms in the same project, and both parts are working. Even authentication isn't broken, everything works. So now we should start planning the modernization. And basically what you will need to do is to take all ASPX pages and all the controls, basically everything which depends on ASP.NET Web Forms, and you need to change it, convert it to .vvm pages. So for example, if you look at this contact page, there is some contact form with few text boxes, some validation and things like that. .vvm has the same tools. There is also text box control. The validation is done a little bit differently. We are using the model validation attributes, so not these required field validators, which I think is great because it's much more simple. But still, you need to convert this ASPX syntax to .vvm syntax. Yeah, so you will probably create a contact page in the views folder, and you need to rewrite this syntax to the .html syntax. Also, the page has code behind. So in the code behind, there is a lot of things happening. So you need to refactor this code behind file to a view model. And I recommend you to take this as an opportunity because, for example, there is quite a lot of code that is sending emails. I don't think this belongs to the code behind of a page because it's the presentation layer, but this is still more business logic. So take this as an opportunity to refactor things away from your code behind. If they contain some business logic, you will need to tear this apart. So keep only things that manipulate with the view model in the view model. But if there is something that depends on the database or any kind of business logic, sending emails, integrations, everything, move this away into some business layer project or something like that. So I would probably create some class called mailer or mailing service or something like that, and have this method moved into such class, because I don't think this belongs to the code behind file. So you need to do the refactoring of this code behind to the .vvm view model. Basically, the most frequent change would be that you won't be able to access the text box controls by their IDs and touch their properties directly. What you will do instead is that you need to expose this property as a view model property, so there will be something like a public string subject, get set, and you will use data binding to bind this property to the text property of the text box, and in the view model code you will just say subject equals this thing. Yeah, so basically instead of touching the controls, you will just be manipulating the properties of the view model, and you will have to use data binding to get these values bound to the components in the user interface. And what's great on this, even if it looks like quite a lot of work, the great advantage I can see there is that view models are testable. So this is also an opportunity to cover your pages with some kind of integration tests or something like that. Yeah. So that's two things you will need to do, but there is a lot of other classes, a lot of other things in the project that you don't need to change at all, because these are not part of the web forms. These are not dependent on .NET Framework, and most of the libraries that are commonly used are supporting .NET standards. So there should be a high chance that the rest of your application should be able to work on .NET Core. So if you just remove web forms artifacts and replace them with something else, which is .vvm, for example, then you will be able to just switch the project to .NET Core or .NET 5. If you think that this is still a lot of work to do to rewrite all the web forms pages, I think that it's still less work than to have to rewrite everything, including doing significant changes in business logic. But still, I understand that if the project is 10 or 15 years old, the modernization process can take a year or maybe two. And I have seen such scenarios, but then you will be running on the most current version of .NET Core, so your application can live for other 10 or 15 years. So I think that it can pay off. If you want to get some help with conversion of ASPX markup to .vvm, I recommend to go to dotvvm.com/webforms. There are two things for you. The first is the cheat sheet with differences between ASPX markup and .vvm markup. So you can see that we don't use the form element, which has to enclose the entire page. We don't have run at server controls, don't need their IDs. .vvm doesn't have view state. Instead, you are working with the view model, which maintains the state of the page, and so on. There is a lot of things. So read through this cheat sheet. It will help you understand the differences between ASPX markup and between .vvm. And you will also see a lot of advantages of the two-way data binding that you can use everywhere, not only in data bound controls in web forms, but everywhere in the page, and it's very powerful. And there is the last tool I want to show you, and this is ASPX to .vvm converter. It's a tool that can simplify the rewriting process of the individual pages. If you take an ASPX page and copy it into this tool, you can see that this tool suggests you some transformations you can do to your markup. This is not 100% reliable. It doesn't cover all the differences between these syntaxes because it's basically impossible, but still the most frequent changes you will need to do, this tool can help you with them. So for example, we don't use run at server. So if you click on this rule and you can click on apply all fixes, it will remove run at server everywhere. So in most of the places, the run at server is just gone. For example, if I go to this rule, change ASP text box to DOT text box. So you can see there is, for example, the text box control. So I can apply this fix and it will help me with the change. So this is now DOT text box, which is valid in DotVVM. And also it created a data binding for me, because having a text box in the page without the data binding of its value, it doesn't make any sense. So this tool also created a data binding to the text property. And it also generates parts of the view model you will probably need. So this also helps you with the conversion of view models, because if you have a text box in the page, there is 100% chance that you will need a string property to store the value which is inside the text box. So you will need to bind the text box to some string property in the view model. So that's the property. You can also copy this into your view model. So there will still be some manual work you will have to do, but we believe that this tool can help you at least with the most frequent transforms you will need to do during the modernization process. I hope that this video was helpful, and we will be happy to hear feedback from and your stories from modernizing of your legacy applications. So if you try to install DotVVM for Visual Studio and try this Add DotVVM features, please let us know. We have just ping us on Twitter or Gitter chat or GitHub or any other way. We will be very happy to talk to you. And if you need help with the modernization, let us know and we are able to help you get DotVVM set up in your project and tell you what you need to do in order to start. So thank you and take care.